What's up, you guys? So this is the part 2 video for the topic of speciation. Some of the things that were not covered in the last video were the rate at which speciation occurs, as well as the types of reproductive barriers that keep closely related species from interbreeding after they have already diverged. As a quick reminder, speciation occurs when one species diverges into two species after the introduction of some reproductive barrier. Speciation can occur relatively quickly or slowly over time. If speciation occurs rapidly, that is to say that the fossil record does not provide evidence of intermediate transition species, we call it punctuated equilibrium. Punctuated equilibrium is achieved when a species diverges relatively quickly and perhaps experiences long periods of stasis where there is little to no change to the species. Gradualism, on the other hand, is achieved when a species diverges slowly over long periods of time through one or more transitional species. Now, once speciation has occurred, there are several prezygotic or postzygotic barriers that prevent closely related species from interbreeding. A zygote is a fertilized egg, so a prezygotic barrier would be a reproductive barrier that prevents fertilization from ever happening in the first place, while a postzygotic barrier would be one that occurs after the gametes have already fused. As an example of a prezygotic barrier, two organisms might experience habitat isolation. This is where two closely related species do not get the opportunity to reproduce because they live in different habitats within the same ecosystem. As an example, one species of garter snake might live primarily in water, while another species of garter snake might live exclusively on land, thereby preventing the two from ever interbreeding. Temporal isolation could also be considered a prezygotic barrier. This is when two closely related species do not interbreed due to different mating times or seasons. This can be seen in spotted skunks. The eastern spotted skunk breeds in late winter, while the western spotted skunk breeds in the fall, thereby preventing the two from ever having the opportunity to interbreed. Behavioral isolation may also serve as a prezygotic barrier. This is when two species have different courtship rituals, which prevent the two species from interbreeding in nature. As an example, the male blue-footed booby performs an elaborate dance to attract a mate, while the masked booby performs a completely different courtship ritual. These behaviors keep the two species from interbreeding in nature. Mechanical isolation, another type of prezygotic barrier, is when two species cannot interbreed due to a morphological incompatibility between the two species' reproductive parts. This can be seen in plants of the Heliconia genus. One species of Heliconia, H. pogonantha, can only be pollinated by hummingbirds with long curved bills, while a different species, H. latispatha, can only be pollinated by hummingbirds with short, straight bills. As a final type of prezygotic barrier, there can also be gametic isolation. This is when the gametes, or sex cells, of two closely related species are molecularly incompatible, thereby preventing a zygote from ever forming. Gametic isolation can be seen in sea urchins, which release their gametes into the water to be picked up by another sea urchin of the same species. The gametes of a purple sea urchin and red sea urchin both have surface proteins that prevent a hybrid zygote from forming. As a quick recap, habitat isolation, temporal isolation, behavioral isolation, mechanical isolation, and gametic isolation are all examples of prezygotic barriers that prevent closely related species from interbreeding in nature. But what about postzygotic barriers? Examples of postzygotic barriers include reduced hybrid viability, reduced hybrid fertility, and hybrid breakdown. Reduced hybrid viability occurs when the gametes of two different species have the opportunity to fuse, but the zygote is unable to fully develop and/or survive long enough to reproduce. This can be seen in some species of salamanders, where the hybrid zygote will develop into a frail organism that will die before it has the opportunity to reproduce. Reduced hybrid fertility occurs when the hybrid zygote develops into a relatively healthy organism, but the hybrid organism is unable to reproduce itself. As an example, a horse and a donkey have the ability to interbreed to produce a mule, but all mules are naturally sterile. As the final type of postzygotic barrier, hybrid breakdown is when the hybrid zygote develops into a viable and fertile organism, but the hybrid's offspring are feeble and or sterile. This can be seen in rice, where certain rice hybrids are fertile, but the following generation is sterile. That's it for speciation. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comment section below, and stay tuned for my next video on extinction.